Good morning, everybody. We're going to try to keep everybody running on time today, both as a courtesy to all of our participants as well as to our guest speakers. So let's get started within a few minutes of on time. I can't see you because of the bright lights, but you can see me, I hope. And on behalf of the Israel Policy Forum Board of Directors, welcome to our morning plenary session entitled The Political Moment. My name is Solow. I'm the Vice Chair of our Executive Committee, and I'm happy to chair this morning's session. This session will be a moderated discussion about the wider political dynamics of this moment and how they ultimately impact the issues you heard about last night, and those we'll be examining throughout the day, namely U.S.-Israel relations, U.S.-Palestinian relations, regional normalization, and securing a two-state future. We'll explore the current political environment in which Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans are operating and the impact it is having on these issues. We are honored to be joined by three extraordinary panelists this morning, all of whom have cleared COVID protocols, I'm happy to say. Although, again, we unfortunately lost one of our panelists for this morning. But our three panelists are Natan Sachs. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, where he also serves as a fellow. His work focuses on Israeli foreign policy, domestic politics, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the U.S.-Israeli relations. He's currently writing a book on Israel's grand strategy and its domestic origins. Shibley Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Got a full Brookings lineup today. His best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2003. Ksenia Svetlova is the director of the Israeli Middle East Relations Program at Midvim, an expert on Middle Eastern studies and a former member of the Knesset. She served for 14 years as a reporter and analyst on Arab affairs on Israel's Channel 9, covering Gaza and the West Bank, and reporting from Tahrir Square, Damascus, Beirut, Manama, and Tripoli. And this panel will be moderated by our own David Halperin, the CEO of Israel Policy Forum, who we heard from last night. He really is somebody who needs no introduction in this crowd, so he's not getting one. I want to remind everyone that this session is on the record and open to the press. Thank you to the members of the press that have joined us this morning. You all do very important work in talking about these issues. Participants can also feel free to post any content from this session on social media, and please make sure to tag Israel Policy Forum. Please take this opportunity right now to silence your cell phones so that we can all enjoy this program. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David and to the panel. Let's all enjoy.
Good morning. Hello. Hope everyone has had their coffees and ready to dive in today. It's really an honor to be with the three individuals on stage here who I follow, dare I say, religiously on social media and everything that these three individuals write. And they're going to enable us to take a couple steps back before we dig deeper into the issues that we touched on last night to talk about kind of the broader environments, as Alan just mentioned. And I just want to say that we're extremely privileged to have someone like Ksenia Svetlova, who's been so sought after in this moment with regard to the tensions in Ukraine and Russia, but even before, leading analyst on issues across the Middle East and region, with experience in the Knesset as well. Shibley, who just informed me that he was named one of the most influential individuals in Washington just recently, and who's really an expert on public opinion. And of course, Natan, who follows all of the intricacies of Israeli politics in and out. And I want to start actually with Shibley, to start here at home in Washington. You know, when the Biden administration came into office, the kind of slogan of the moment was that it's the 3 C's, right? Climate, COVID, and China. And it's clearly taken a turn from climate, COVID, and China. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about the Biden administration and how it is prioritizing or not the issues of the Middle East. You know, for the last, decade or so, we've heard talk of the pivot to Asia, the concern of the region that the United States is abandoning the region. How much is there truth to that? How much does the Biden administration genuinely care about engaging, not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the wider region today? And where do you see this taking shape with the upcoming midterms and more?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for hosting me. I've been speaking at IPF forums for many years, and it's always a pleasure. And sorry to miss Michael as well, who I know has tested positive for COVID. Whatever the Biden administration's policy is toward Israel-Palestine, it really is not at all a function of any pivot from the Middle East. I say that not because there may not be a pivot. I mean, obviously the Middle East has, in the mind of Washington elites, both Democrats and Republicans, has diminished in strategic value, and that is, not a secret in general, although obviously we always discover that it's more important than they think it is. But on Israel-Palestine, I think, look, the U.S. support for Israel, which is, as you know, has been extraordinary and increased over time rather than diminished, means the U.S. is involved. The U.S. is a party to what happens on Israel-Palestine. The U.S. is not a, kind of just an observer. The Israeli-Palestinian issue for the U.S. is not like any other issue in that regard. And there's an American responsibility that goes, that what we call the asymmetry of power that we now have between Israel and the Palestinians is, in great part a function of the American support for Israel over the years that is continuing and likely to continue no matter what happens. So the U.S. is involved. It can't not be involved. So the fact that it is not a top priority for the administration is not a surprise given all of the things that you've said, meaning, COVID, the economy, now, of course, Ukraine, all the issues that we all as Americans care about and think are top priority. I don't think they're, kind of like people are blaming them for focusing on those issues, including people who care about Israel-Palestine, right? Because we all want America to be better. And obviously, this comes in when we're highly polarized in America after 4 years of the Trump administration, that in my opinion have been devastating, both at home and abroad, but let that be a side point. So I think the surprise to me is not that this issue is not top priority. Frankly, no one now believes that this is a good point to make peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think that's clear. The problem is that the administration has fallen on several mantras. We support the two-state solution. We don't support anybody doing unilateral steps. And they're very much out of step with the reality on the ground, where in fact it might be too late for the two-state solution. I happen to think it is. It doesn't mean it can't be revived, but right now we have a reality of one state. It's been more than a century of occupation. At what point do you say, well, people are living their lives. This is their lives. It's not just a temporary state of affairs. Michael was part of a study group, as you know, that issued a report just before the administration and warned against kind of like complacency with the new Israeli government being, sort of like saying, just having a status quo and normalizing the status quo for the administration. And I think they also warned against the administration simply adopting the Abraham Accords as kind of a framework that then would have consequences for Israel-Palestine. They warned against that because I think that is adopting a framework that just simply cannot work for Israel-Palestine, but that's exactly what the administration has done.
And just for reference, this is Michael Koplow contributed to a study that was jointly produced by the Brookings Institution and the Center for New American Security, so you can reference that. You know, I want to kind of take this one step further because we're talking about the question of the deprioritization of the Palestinian issue and whether it is still an issue that resonates here in Washington as a policy goal. But I wonder if I could turn that question to you, Ksenia. Does it resonate at all in the Arab world? From your conversations and travels, we've seen the Abraham Accords, we've seen countries that clearly want to sideline or not involve themselves with the Palestinian issue. Does the Palestinian issue no longer resonate with the Arab world? And then I'm going to turn to Natan to ask the same about the Israeli space and whether the Palestinian issue is still an animating one in Israeli politics.
First of all, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Boker tov, shalom. In referring to your question, I would like to say yes and no, because as with everything in the Middle East, we are living the contradiction, the world of the contradiction. I noticed that the Palestinian issue has stopped being the main priority for the Arab world in the beginning of the Arab Spring. It's a decade ago. It didn't happen today, it didn't happen after the Abraham Accords, the vice versa. The Abraham Accords were one of the results of the processes that are shaking the Middle East violently during the last 20 years. It's the war in Iraq, it's 9/11 before that, it's the Arab Spring, and during all of these processes, the Palestinians slowly but surely, yes, we saw it on the news editions of Al Jazeera, that suddenly, you know, in 2011, I saw that you can basically during the half an hour of the news bulletin, you see everything. You see there Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and if there is something extraordinary, but then in the last, you know, in the lineup, in the end of the lineup, you will get something from the PA or Gaza. But it doesn't mean that if the Arab world is not focusing every single day, every single minute, as it used to perhaps to do during the Intifada or after that, that it is not important. This is this common assumption, it's more of a talking point, that the Arabs has dismissed Palestinians and betrayed them, that they are not interested in them anymore. And I can tell you that there is certainly, you know, from the conversations that I have, also with policymakers, with just ordinary people that are meeting in various conferences, and there is no lack of those, as you know, from Emirates, from Bahrain, from Saudi Arabia. The Palestinians are important, and the Arab world is waking up when something dramatic is happening, especially when it is happening when the focal point is Jerusalem, yes, Al-Aqsa. And this triggers every single vibe in the Arab world. So whoever thinks that you can just, you know, be oblivious to what is happening in Gaza and PA and say, well, you know, you have these wonderful accords, and I embrace them, I support them fully. But it doesn't mean that, you know, having this framework is enough for everything else, meaning our relations, bilateral relations with the other Arab states, Egypt and Jordan, with the Palestinians especially. And I saw that many in the Israeli government were very much surprised by this very violent and aggressive backlash from the Jordanian government after the events right now in Al-Aqsa. Well, it only comes as a surprise to somebody who doesn't understand how important is Al-Aqsa, how important is Jerusalem still, and somebody who perhaps convinced himself that if we are in good terms right now with UAE or Bahrain or Morocco, then it means that, you know, events in Jerusalem will not longer be important and be crucial, you know, for forming a public opinion in the Arab world about Palestinians and Israelis.
Mm-hmm. Natan, turning the question back to you about, you know, the Israeli political system has been all about Bibi for some time, but traditionally the political spectrum has been divided on the Palestinian issue. I wonder if that's still the case. Is the Palestinian issue still at the core of how Israeli politics is shaped on the spectrum of the left and the right?
Well, good morning from me as well, and thank you so much for having me. It's a treat to see so many very good friends here in the crowd, and also an honor to speak alongside these two very distinguished friends. I'm just going to steal Ksenia's excellent answer, yes and no. So if you look first at the Israeli political system, and there have been a few elections, as you may have noticed in recent times, not one of them was featured about the Palestinian issue. That was not an issue that any party put at the front, far from it. Many parties, especially on the left and what is now called the center, because no one wants to be left in Israel, or very few, hide that issue. They talk about other issues. Sometimes you will hear that, of course. I'm exaggerating somewhat, but it's definitely not the core, it's not the ticket that anyone runs on. On the right, they will sometimes use that, but they will use that more as a boogeyman, right? If you vote for the center, which is really a radical left, of course, then you should be very careful. Something will happen on the Palestinian front. So on the surface, it's been all about Bibi. It's been the Bibi camp and the change camp, and it's really consolidated in some ways new surface camps that are quite different from the past. We see people who, in terms of the Palestinian issue, we would consider very, very right wing, including Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who has not changed an inch on this issue, is vociferously, openly opposed to a two-state solution on ideological and security grounds. And he's certainly not alone in the coalition in this regard. So you see them in the change camp, on the one hand. On the other hand, in deep structures, the fact that this is an issue we're still talking about, the fact that the right wing, the fact that this coalition may not survive another month, the fact that the right in this coalition is under so much pressure, the fact that creating this coalition is so anomalous is because in deep structural terms, there still is a right-left axis. It is not only about the Palestinian issue. It never was only about the Palestinian issue. There's religiosity, there's other affiliations, background affiliations, social affiliations, even some geography in small Israel. But the bottom line, the key issue on which someone would be called a leftist or a right-winger in Israel would be how open they are to concessions, whether to the Arab states originally, now more to the Palestinians, in return for peace. So the old 80s battle between the whole land of Israel on the right and land for peace on the left, it is still there. It's motivated by different things. Now you'll see, for example, if you listen to Bennett when he's trying to explain to his base how could he collaborate with Meretz or even Ram, the Palestinian-based party, how could he collaborate? He's saying there will be no negotiations, there'll be no new disengagement. That's the first thing he wants to emphasize. It's not the only thing. There's religious issues, but that's the first thing. So yes or no?
Yeah. I actually wanted to build a little bit on that, because within this bizarre constellation of a coalition, they've had to grapple with what the entire world is grappling with which is the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and Russia's war against Ukraine. And Ksenia, I wanted to ask you in particular this question of the way in which Israel has approached this conflict. I mean, we heard there was some questions about Israel's support for Ukraine initially, which has a bit subsided against tensions with Russians' comments and increasing support for Israel for field hospitals and the like. But it's all, much of the Israeli response that we've heard, it has been concern about relations with Russia vis-a-vis Syria and Israel's freedom to operate in Syria as it needs. And I wonder, how much is that real? Is that really a concern? Is Russia's increasing influence, or influence at all in Syria, really a motivating factor in how Israel is viewing the Ukraine-Russia issue?
Some 31 years ago, before we made Aliyah to Israel, we were sitting in Moscow kitchen, and my mother was arguing with some friends who also were about to make Aliyah about what Israel is like. Nobody has been to Israel before. We hardly saw any pictures or photos of Israel. And they were saying that it's more like US, and she was saying that it's more like Europe. Wow, we go there, and then it's more like Middle East. But there's actually this question of belonging, where do you belong?
Yeah.
Do you belong with collective West? But if you do, definitely, we are ally of United States. We are a liberal democratic country. But does it mean that all of our concerns that has to do with Middle East, with this chaos that is called Syria, they can be just dismissed? Okay, so I think this is the root, yes, of this balancing act that Israel still tries, to pull on Russia and Ukraine. There has been an evolution of this attitude of where do we stand vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Ukraine during the last 3 months. The Syrian issue is, yes, it is very strong. It is very influential. It is very critical because we do know what might happen if indeed we will be blocked, from the Syrian skies. But I can tell you that even this is being discussed right now. There are already some, elements in the security establishment. There are some ex-generals that are posing the question: if at the, end game we will have to do something, we will be, for example, pressured more by the U.S., or God forbid there will be more atrocities that will make it impossible, to continue with this current policy. Yeah. And we will have to make a stand. What will be happening then? Will we be forced to stop acting against our enemies, meaning Iran, in Syria? I personally do not see such a possibility as real, as viable, So again, there is this great reevaluation of Russia's might, abilities, its army worldwide, So we are part of that. But just one small thing, before I finish. 1 year before Syria, 1 year before Russia became our neighbor in the north, in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, it was published in Haaretz that Obama team had pressured a great deal the Israeli government, then led by Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to condemn the annexation of Crimea. And it never happened, So it was before, Syria became a critical factor in this. So what I mean is that apart from Syria, which is really real, I do not dismiss it at all, but there is also some kind of function traditional Israeli foreign policy to try to stay on the good terms with all of the great powers, especially those who are involved here in the region, in the Middle East.
So I want to ask one more question, which is Shibley outlined a dynamic where the administration has really not been engaging deeply in this issue. And I wonder, from the perception of the region, what's the perception of the United States engagement in the broader region today?
If you will look through the main Israeli media for the last couple of years, I think even more, if you can run even like 5 years back, you will see that the major theme is that U.S. is leaving without leaving, without announcing that it's leaving, but it's disengaging from the area. And if it does, then what will happen next in terms of security? What will happen in Iraq? The Chinese are growing much more influential there. What will be happening in Syria? You have Russia there. Then on the critical issues, and again, here Israel is looking at the situation through the Middle Eastern lens, like Saudis, like Emiratis, like everybody else, who right now play this kind of interesting game in regards to the American demands. And what will happen next when you guys will be leaving? We will be here alone, facing whatever threats that might come from Iran, number one, and then from other great powers that might try their luck in this region.
Mm-hmm. Which leads me to you, Shibley, because you've done a tremendous amount of work for many, many years examining the trends of public opinion in the United States about issues impacting foreign policy, and particularly United States policy in the broader Middle East. I wonder if you can give us a snapshot of where are we today in terms of American sentiment on all of these kinds of issues. What are the trends that you are watching within the broader American public opinion about this view of the United States, pulling back?
Thanks. If you allow me, though, first I would really like to address the Israel and the Ukraine issue a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I agree that one reason beyond Syria, obviously, is the Israel trying to stay in good terms with big powers goes back to the very origin of Israel, when it followed a non-identification policy initially between the Soviet Union and the U.S., forced to take sides in the Korean War, and obviously played that. But I think there's something more going on here, honestly. And it has to do with the fact that Israeli foreign policy on the right in the past many years has essentially allied itself with authoritarians in the Arab world as key allies. We see the Abraham Accords as a product of that, but even before that. And in a way, all of them had a very good relationship with Russian President Putin as a kind of a support group in a world that is becoming less liberal, including in Israel itself. And so there was I think there's a little bit of a club And I do think also that initially it was not entirely clear that Russia was going to be on the losing side for many people. Obviously, increasingly looks like it would be on the, and so there's a little bit of hedging of the bets with that regard, particularly given, the fact that there may be a pivot. Obviously, at least there's a sense in the Middle East that there is a pivot away from the Middle East. But on public opinion, it's really kind of that's where I think there's an unbelievable gap between where the Democratic president, Joe Biden, and many members of Congress are on this issue, and public opinion, particularly on the Democratic side. So I've been testing this for more than 3 decades. You're right; it's a long time, and clearly, what we see is that more Democrats have become more and more, that is at the public opinion level, more and more critical of Israel, while Republicans have become more and more embracing of right-wing Israel. I mean, that all the polls have shown that over time. But among Democrats, this has been accelerated over the past decade, really beginning with the Obama administration through the Trump administration, in ways that put Democrats in a very different position from the articulated position of the administration. For example, in the Gaza war in May, when we did a poll in terms of where Democrats were, more Democrats blamed Israel than blamed Hamas for the war. And Democrats were dissatisfied with the way Biden handled. In fact, half of Democrats disapproved, half of young Democrats disapproved of Biden's position. And what we have seen over time is that while among Democrats, still a majority want the U.S. to take neither the Palestinian side nor the Israeli side, among those who want the U.S. to take side, more people in some of the polls by a ratio of 2 to 1 want the U.S. to take the Palestinian side over Israel's side. So it's really quite a different outlook when you're looking at the picture. Also, Democrats are half of Democrats have never heard of the BDS movement. But of those who have heard at least a little, they're more positive about it than negative about it. And overwhelmingly, all Democrats and Republicans don't want laws to be passed that outlaw boycotts of Israel. So you have a completely different environment. And what's protecting the administration from that kind of wave of public opinion is right now, like we're talking about, is a priority. Of course, it's not a priority for most people. So, if you're a Democrat, you're not going to, stop from voting for a Democratic candidate against a Trumpist. I mean, none of us are in this environment. So that's what's protecting it. There's still a big lag between members of Congress. And that's shifting as we know, but there's a big lag. And obviously, public opinion isn't the only factor. In fact, very often it's not the major factor. As on gun control, for example, or for that matter, on abortion, it isn't the critical issue in policy on Israel-Palestine. Of course, you have campaign contributions, lobbying, issues of that sort that outweigh public opinion in the political process. But what it does is that there was a kind of a marked correlation after the handling of Biden of the Gaza war in May and his decline. His decline wasn't principally over his handling of the Gaza war. But what happens is that this issue has become kind of a part of a big value package among Democrats, particularly. I mean, we're in a value war in America, and obviously the democracy, human rights are seen through that context. And Israel-Palestine, for most Democrats, I'm not going to say about most Republicans because I am happy to talk about it later. There's a completely different dynamic. I'm writing a book on evangelicals, politics in Israel on this issue. But for most Democrats, Israel-Palestine is not seen through a strategic prism. It's seen through social justice, democracy, and human rights prism, and has become kind of in some ways, a test for many Democrats. And I think that's where, when I look at the administration and the president, I think he's it's like he's a throwback to a different era of Democratic politics.
So obviously that suggests shifts in the years ahead, or pretends to shifts in the year ahead. And I kind of want to take that view of this deepening polarization that, as you said, we're seeing across a whole wide range of issues. And I want to ask, how is that impacting U.S. and its engagement with both Israel and the wider region? Because Natan, we talked about how the Palestinian issue used to be an animating factor, or to the extent that it is and is not still an animating factor in Israeli politics. But one of the things in Israeli politics used to be the importance of strong relations with the United States. And we have Joe Biden planning to go to Israel in about a month, I believe, at least reported that he's planning in late June. And it used to be viewed that the Israeli prime minister, must be a great English speaker who can identify, one-on-one with the U.S. president. And I wonder how much polarization and the politics, Democrats versus Republicans, has impacted that view in Israel versus the tensions of the Obama years and the, celebrations that we saw in Israel during the Trump years. And here we are with Biden, that returns to a kind of mainstream, if you will, view as Shibley's describing. So how much does this still animate how Israelis and Israeli politics think about the U.S.'s relationship, this polarization?
On a deep level, I think there's a constant, which is if you ask Israelis across the board about the Israeli-U.S. relationship, certainly within the security establishment, the general establishment, there is a very wide consensus that this is an absolute pillar, if not the pillar, of Israeli foreign policy and national security. And so even those who advocated, certainly around 2015, policies that heightened polarization around Israel and partisanship around Israel, they would certainly give lip service at least to the idea that Israel should try to be bipartisan, and would argue, and I've heard them argue actually, that when Netanyahu came to speak in Congress, for example, which obviously was extremely unpopular among Democrats, it was a necessary evil. They won't say it wasn't a problem. They won't say it didn't hurt things on the Democratic side, and that isn't lamentable, but they say it was worth it or necessary. Many others think it was a bad idea. So at the bottom line, Israelis are still very much in favor of very close relations with the United States, perhaps more so than in the past. Bennett's English is excellent too. That's not why he became prime minister by any means, but it is also excellent. And it certainly was, when Netanyahu was running in the last several elections, one of the main very famous campaigns was huge signs of pictures of him with world leaders. And Putin was there, and that was very notable, but it wasn't just that. It was also Trump. And it wasn't just because it's Trump. It was also because he's the U.S. president. So you would not see that without the U.S. president. You often hear, I sometimes hear in English people saying, will Israel, opt for Russia or China over the United States? I don't hear that in Hebrew. There are others here who work in Israel. I've never heard a serious conversation about maybe Israel should choose that over this. I will say though, that there are very important calculations in the Israeli perspective, and not just the Israeli one. I think it's worldwide, and it's true in other countries in the Middle East, which is that we used to say in the United States that politics stops at the water's end. I'm probably misquoting it somehow, but that's not remotely the case anymore, right? Today, foreign policy, as is the case of Israel, in the United States too, is now a projection of our domestic politics in at least certain key areas. Some things are constant, and actually the Israeli-Palestinian issue is more constant than many other issues. Shibley just mentioned the Biden administration's behavior during the Gaza war was not dramatically different than we might have seen if it was a Republican president. But on many other issues, it's very different. Prime among them in the Middle East are two, Iran and Saudi Arabia, where Iran, you saw a dramatically different approach from Trump versus Obama, and now Biden versus Trump, or at least attempting to take a different approach, and Saudi Arabia, which, at least for another few weeks, is persona non grata in the Biden administration. We'll see what happens when Biden goes to the Middle East. And that is, of course, dramatically different from Trump, whose first visit abroad was to Saudi Arabia. So this leads to one thing, and I'll end on this, which is that there is this view, and it's unfortunately a correct view, that on some issues, select issues, the United States has a pendulum, a foreign policy pendulum. And when Biden was elected, when, finally 3 days later, CNN, Fox News, I guess, most importantly, declared that Biden won the election, Israelis, certainly in the Netanyahu camp, looked at their watch and started calculating the days till when can Nikki Haley become president? Because if you wait long enough, then, okay, we have to weather this Biden era, But then, who knows? Maybe we'll win the lottery again, and then everything is open, just as it was in the Trump years. And this is unfortunate not because of Biden or Nikki Haley or anything like that, but because for the United States to conduct foreign policy in any part of the world where people are counting the days till the next November, it's not a healthy way certainly for a superpower like the United States to conduct itself. And that's very dangerous, whether you're right, left, or care about Oceania or the Middle East. That is a real danger of U.S. foreign policy, and I don't think it's going away.
Ksenia, I wonder if you'd respond to that, because it strikes me that the Biden administration has talked about the importance of expanding on the Abraham Accords, but of course it was the Trump administration that was able to make the Abraham Accords possible by pursuing arms sales that previously would not have even been discussed, let alone actually advanced, and of course the recognition of Western Sahara in the case of Morocco. Is the view of the region the same that Natan just described, which is waiting for Nikki Haley before advancing the normalization?
Well, regarding Abraham Accords, it's an interesting thing, because everything is so polarized, of course, in Israel and in the United States. So there's this perception that unlike the previous peace accords that were signed with Egypt, which is also no closer to being a democracy and the protector of human rights than UAE, for example, yes, or Bahrain, with Jordan, they somehow are better than the current set of a normalization effort and peace agreements with these free Arab countries. Yes, I'm talking about Morocco, UAE, and Bahrain. This polarization is going very deep. In fact, I'm just publishing right now a big article in Haaretz about how the civil society in Israel, its left wing, center left wing, is dismissing completely the Abraham Accords. It's not part of this, not part of this dynamics. And this dynamics is very vibrant. It's encompassing. You have almost everything, from women entrepreneurs to cooperation in university and research and trade and everything else. And then a lot of allegations are being thrown as like why Israel is getting closer to the authoritarian Arab regimes. Well, when there will be other Arab regimes, we will be perhaps aligning ourselves with them. Right now, it is what it is. Okay, so the question is the long, old, almost half a century long dream of Israel that once we will be having hummus in Damascus. Let's say we will be having hummus in Damascus. Who will be ruling Damascus then? Will it be a liberal democracy? Will it be even a liberal democracy? No, probably not. So there's this question of whether you choose to move forward and expand the web of relations in the region and cling basically to the only positive moment that had happened in this region for a long, long while. If you're looking 20 years back and you're going from wars to assassinations to unsuccessful revolutions that never brought the nations to the promised land of democracy and success. So then I think that the Biden administration decision to focus on this frame and perhaps to try to do what we in Mitvim has suggested a year or so ago, it's expanding this frame, changing its frame from within, putting more substance into these agreements. Mm-hmm. And of course, we do see the dynamics with Jordan and Egypt that they did not jump on the wagon immediately, but I think that during the last year and a half, there has been development, and Ambassador Herzog yesterday spoke about it, that were unprecedented. Before 10 years, 20 years, I'm exploring Egypt almost all of my life, and I can count by numbers, the visits of the ministers of foreign affairs, in Egypt to Israel and so on. Yeah. The downside of it, of course, is that, this talk about the neglecting the Palestinian issue. Yes, if indeed it will be neglected, I think it will be just, it will be an explosion that will, again, surprise everybody, including Biden administration, if they are not careful enough to connect between the two tracks. Right now, the Palestinian track, well, it's leading nowhere. It's, leading to the impasse, and it's out there alone. And you have this wonderful dynamic of the Abraham Accords. If you do not make these two tracks, coincide and go together, then the end of it can be very unfortunate. But then again, given the low priority of the Middle East, I'm not fooling myself, in the midst of everything that is happening in the world, by the American administration, for them to prioritizing something in the Middle East and trying to, think maybe through this frame, we can do something else. Maybe we can connect the dots at some point, So this is the beginning of something that was not there with the previous administration. It was just not in the, not included. It was not part of the calculation. Right. So that's, I think that, again, it's all very complicated. There are different angles. I interviewed now for my piece many Israeli activists and politicians, and some of them told me, listen, it's not even a real country, talking about the countries of the Abraham Accords. And others told me, well, it's authoritarian. There is a problem with the human rights. And so there are human rights violations also in the PA and in Jordan and in Egypt. Doesn't that bother you? So there were always, something that has to do, of course, a lot with the identity of those who signed initially the agreements, the authors of these agreements. And the question is whether the other side of the map will be able to, along with Biden administration, say, well, there is something. Also, a peace accord with Egypt was not brought to us by Golda Meir, but by Menachem Begin. Right. Can we capitalize on this? Right. Can we change it? Can we expand on it and turn it into something that is even better?
Yeah, I think, Shibley, you may want to add something, because I'm kind of curious when we think about, what is the big prize in terms of extending the Abraham Accords? It's Saudi Arabia. And yet with the relations here in Washington, Democrats and Republicans have different views, perhaps. I wonder if you could explore that. When you think of Saudi Arabia and you think of the big prize of Israel-Saudi relations, often we identify Saudi Arabia as being the country that has said not without progress or not without something tangible on the Palestinian front. Is that true? And how much does polarization in Washington impact the question of Saudi Arabia being a part of the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, first of all, in terms of what expansion means, you're absolutely right. Because from the Israeli point of view, the big prize is Saudi Arabia. And the other countries are less significant in the relationship. That was the big prize from the very beginning, as you know. Yeah. And the UAE was kind of a way to get into Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis obviously, gave the green light for Bahrain. Bahrain would not have entered into this agreement without a Saudi green light. That was seen as a consolation prize, so to speak, in the deal. We, of course, don't really know exactly what the Saudi calculation at this point is, in part because we don't know the extent to which it's mostly the crown prince who wants a deal and the father is opposed to it. That's obviously a rumor. Or the extent to which the crown prince himself senses deep opposition to this, delinking it from Israel-Palestine. That remains an open question. But nonetheless, I think let's look at it from the point of view of the Biden administration. Where I think they're making a big mistake is by playing this up as if it's their central feature of Middle East policy. They're celebrating the accords or having activities focused on the reports. I think the UAE and Israel particularly have really succeeded in using the accords as a way of endearing themselves to the to the Biden administration, and in a way having the Biden administration adopt these accords as a framework, even on Israel-Palestine. I think that's a mistake, because I think to try to push Saudi Arabia to join the accords without anything on Israel-Palestine is a mistake, because I think, frankly, it plays into the hands of those who say, why should we compromise? Even the Saudis are coming on board. It's a mistake. And I think that if to the extent that you care about at some point getting to a just peace in Israel-Palestine, you don't want to decouple this normalization from Israel-Palestine. You don't want to not extract some concessions related to it. I also think that the administration is making a big political mistake. They attacked the Trump administration. Frankly, the Abraham Accords came the last minute. After the Trump Middle East policy had failed, the first focus was Israel-Palestine in the context of big regional accord. They put in the deal of the century. It flopped. They were about to finish the term with nothing. The UAE bailed them out. Obviously, then other countries joined, but let's be honest, without the UAE, this would not have happened. The UAE bailed them out. The administration could not say no to peace between Israel and the Arab states. That's not going to happen in Washington, whether you're Democrat or Republican. That's fine. That's what you're going to get. But then to adopt them as if they're the biggest achievement in the world, think about coming, the next presidential election when whatever Trumpist is running and saying, look, they're running with what we've achieved. This is our policy. This is the people who were party to that. They're also hurting themselves even politically in this regard. So I think they're making a big mistake by making this a central feature of the Middle East policy. And I think the trip, if the president does take it next month, I think it'll again create an unnatural, detrimental link between the Accords and Israel-Palestine. Gives the impression that something is happening on the core issue, where in fact we see what's happening every day. The reality on the ground is unacceptable. They should be focused. Okay, you don't want to get two-state solution. You don't think diplomacy is going to happen tomorrow, but the reality on the ground between Israel and Palestinians, particularly among Palestinians who are under occupation, is so unacceptable, so intolerable, that they ought to be focused specifically on those issues. Forget about the political horizon for now. Deal with the reality as it now exists. It's a reality that cannot be tolerated. Don't pretend that it's temporary. More than a half a century is not temporary. And nobody I know thinks that, even those who are hopeful about a two-state solution don't think it's going to happen in the next 10 years. Deal with the reality as it is. Don't provide a framework that seems to legitimize it, normalize it, make it look like this is acceptable, that this is tolerable. It's a mistake.
Yeah, and I think this issue of how to extend the Abraham Accords in a way that actually will impact in a positive way the Israeli-Palestinian arena is something that we at Israel Policy Forum have paid a lot of attention to. And Shira Efron, Evan Gottesman, and Michael Koplow wrote a report about this question as well. And I know, Ksenia, you've looked at this question quite a lot as well. And of course, the extension of the benefits of regional relations to impact positively the Israeli-Palestinian arena is one that's not only critical for the United States to pursue, but also there's a gap, there's a block not only from the Palestinians who have been opposed to engagement with the Abraham Accords, but also from some of the regional players themselves. Ksenia, I want to turn back to you to ask: Is that really a function of the personalities, the leaders of the moment having bad relations? Is there something deeper? Do we see that is that the new normal in terms of the Gulf states? I mean, we talked about this a bit before, about whether this issue resonates, but how do you see the evolution of the relationship of the Palestinian leadership with the Arab world as relates to the Abraham Accords going forward?
First of all, I just have to refer to what my friend Shibley just said about the Palestinians and the situation in the West Bank specifically. If nothing positive will happen, I absolutely agree. We are heading to the disaster. And it will shake also the Abraham Accords, not to perhaps the degree that it will dismiss them or cancel them. But certainly there will be circumstances. There will be influence, and nobody will be able to say we didn't know about this, because this is work in process. We are looking at what is happening economically, politically, security-wise, of course, yes, and we are heading to the disaster. No less than this. About the relations between the Palestinians and the Gulf states, well, I think it runs much deeper than the personal relations. It's the conviction, first of all, of the leaders of these Gulf states that they are right now, since the focus, the power has swifted to them from Egypt, from the traditional, centers of power in the Middle East, in a way. They will never, discuss it publicly. They will not try to, shame Egypt. But we know who gives money to whom now in order to, maintain their livelihood and prevent from them to just go into the, financial catastrophe. So I think these countries right now, they are focusing on something different. They try to build the new architecture of, also regional relations, security in the region, international relations, and of course, immersing themselves in the middle of all of this. So it means that the diffusion of their attention brings to, that they don't see the Palestinians anymore. Yes, I'm talking about the leadership level. It's not important anymore. It's important. It's not that they don't exist. And of course, they, try to mention it, by the way, every time, that they're speaking to the Israelis. I noticed that during the Negev summit, the coverage in the Israeli press omitted the Palestinians completely. The Palestinians were not discussed. It was the headline of Israel Hayom and also other outlets. In the Gulf press, it was all about the Palestinians. It was only about the Palestinians. All of the Negev summit was only about them. Okay, but generally, when today we are looking at UAE mending ties with Turkey, trying to have some stabilization, perhaps, in the region between Turkey and Qatar and Saudi, the axis of resistance are being brought at bay, more or less. The financial blockade of Qatar didn't bring the fruit that they were hoped that it will bring. Now they're going for this mending of ties and improving of climate in general between them, but also between the Iranians. So they're playing with the big boys now. And the Palestinians and their conflict with Israel, basically, as Israeli, I look at it this way. They're telling us, guys, we will not help you in any kind of way with your conflict. You are there alone. We will not help Palestinians. We will not help you. You are free to do whatever you are doing, okay? If you will get to, at some point, to talking to each other and you will need some money, then we might help, okay? We might help, from the outside. But we will not be involved with your petty conflict with who is taking what land from whom, who is killing whom. We are not just getting inside of this. We are out there. We are with the United States. We are right now. It's the Gulf states who decide whether to produce more oil or not. And this is, of course, a detrimental issue for the whole world. So in all of this, the Palestinian issue, yes, it's going a little bit more far away. So there is big difference between the common sentiment, which you saw during the war in Gaza. I know that there's clear example from the UAE that was very interesting because the reactions of the Emirati government to the war were, there was criticism, but it was not as, vicious, it was not as aggressive as it used to be before. Mm-hmm. But on the level of the people, the BDS opened their first office in the UAE during this war. And I know many Emiratis who were fascinated by Israel before the war. And after the war, well, they got to, get to understand more the other side. So you have this dichotomy, as always, it's between the, popular sentiment and then the governments. And of course, there's been bad blood between Abu Mazen and between many regional leaders. It's not only Emiratis. It's also the Egyptian government. They had this miscommunication for quite a few years. The donors who give the money to the PA, they say, well, we'll give you enough money now to build a new Singapore, which is, not perhaps so true because there was always a difference between the pledges and between the real money that was going into the, Palestinian economy. Yeah. But nevertheless, so there are many elements, but main of them is that, the countries, they become not just any other countries. They are the center of their world now. Mm-hmm. They focus, that's why it's so important that Israel will have, will be on good terms with them and will have good relations. But as for the Palestinians, I think that there is this anticipation for changing of generation in Palestinian leadership in the West Bank. Okay, Gaza is different, it's Hamas. But for West Bank, we will have to wait and see. And also to appreciate whether there is a chance that they will try to install somebody who they support, of course, yes, yeah, to leadership in Ramallah, which is Mohammed Dahlan.
So we're going to dig more into those issues in our next breakout sessions for those of us who are here. But I want to bring us back to Israeli politics for a moment, Natan, because we've talked a lot now about the Palestinian issue, the views in the U.S. We've talked about the region and the Abraham Accords, which we'll speak more about later this afternoon as well. But I wonder if we could just talk for a moment about this Israeli political moment. You mentioned earlier maybe the government will survive another month. But in particular, earlier you mentioned that there's essentially nobody wants to be identified as left. And in some cases that includes Ra'am, the Israeli Arab Party, which is also not really prioritizing its view on the Palestinian issue, rather the state of the Israeli Arab community inside Israel. And I wonder, has this experiment failed? Will we know? How do we know if this succeeded or failed? Will we see such a constellation in the future? Is after years and years of no party representing Palestinian citizens of Israel being part of the Israeli governing coalition, we had Ra'am dramatically join. Is this a one-off, or is this the new normal?
Thanks. That's a great question. And I think there are a lot of other people in the room, but also on the stage, who can offer a very good insight that I see Neri Zilber and others here, and of course Shibley, who follows us very closely. There's two sides to this question. I mean, the experiment, I think you mean, of Ra'am being part of the coalition.
Yeah.
So there's two sides to that. One is, could Ra'am or another party, based on mostly the votes of Palestinian citizens of Israel, could they do such a thing again? And the second is, would they be accepted by the coalition, which is a very big question. It's not an obvious one. So on the first, I don't know, and Shibley may be able to tell us much more. Obviously, Mansour Abbas, who leads Ra'am, has been very courageous personally, has been really leading them to a place where they are obviously extremely unpopular with other parts of their own society. We see the joint list, they dislike many parts of the Israeli political system, but I think none more right now than Ra'am, perhaps. And so in that sense, it's very dramatic, and I don't know. I don't know if it lasts after Mansour Abbas. There are very different vectors happening in the Arabic-speaking population in Israel, which is, of course, very diverse and complicated. There's both integration, but there's also much more identification now with the general Palestinian cause. We saw that a year ago, and we see that even last week. And so that is an open question that I can't answer. Will the the Jewish-dominated Israeli political system accept another party? I think probably yes. It will be very hard, but I think here a real precedent was made, and it was, of course, made ironically by Abu Yair, the man who called himself, in the Arabic term, father of Yair, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu, because Ra'am was kosherized or made halal, not by Bennett, certainly. It was made halal by Abu Yair. He was the one who campaigned suddenly, in a very strange turn, saying, you know what, I can actually maybe go with them. First, he identified in Mansour Abbas someone who would do it, and Mansour Abbas was speaking seriously about a deal. I don't know if he would join a Netanyahu coalition necessarily, but certainly would negotiate with them seriously over matters that matter to him and to his community. And I'll remind you, on many, 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 many issues, he is very right-wing. This is an Islamic movement, right? So on social issues and many others, they are very conservative, and openly so, of course. So that's the first time it broke. And secondly, we saw, Bennett, Lapid, and Mansour Abbas sitting together for the photograph, right? Openly signing a coalition agreement. This is not the old deals. The old kind of politics where there was cooperation many times, we saw actually when the government was sworn in. Then there were two members of the joint list, the two big leaders, Odeh and Tibi, who were waiting outside the plenary. They waited to see if the coalition would pass. It got 60 votes. By the way, not 61. It got 60 votes because one of Ra'am abstained. And then they came in and voted against. And it was pretty clear that if necessary, one of them may forget to come in. And then the coalition could pass 60 to 59, even without them. And this was, of course, a pragmatic and good move by them, but this was the old way it was always done. Sort of behind the scenes, we'll cooperate, we'll try to even, maybe in the case of the Rabin government, actually make moves that would help this community, but not out in the open. Abbas really changed that, Mansour Abbas really changed that, and Bennett and Lapid changed that, and even Netanyahu changed that. Of course, we now see a huge campaign about this is the Shura government, referencing the Shura Council of the Islamic Party of Ra'am. And now from the right wing, this is the end of the world, and Bennett betrayed everyone by going with Abbas. But most Israelis remember, even 18 months ago, their memory does go back that far, and they remember that Netanyahu was negotiating with Mansour Abbas. So that was a big, long way of saying I don't know. I really genuinely don't know about how it would happen within the Arab community in Israel. On the Jewish side, my guess is that the dam has been broken. It won't be easy, it won't be simple, but there's a real precedent here that I think is very important and could be beneficial in strange ways. Nonetheless, I think very positive.
Shibley, did you want to add?
And just on this issue, particularly about Palestinian Israeli citizens, I've done polling there as well, and the last one was I think about 3 years ago, in which one of the findings, long before Ram became so central in politics, that the vast majority of Arab citizens of Israel supported the idea of the joint list or any Arab party joining the government at that time. They wanted to be part of it. They think that's part of the way to show influence. They're nothing to do with their position in Israel or on the Palestinian issue. They're supportive of the Palestinian issue. It's about the instrumentalism, the participation, and they would have supported Ayman Odeh if that had an opening to join. They would have supported him. Ram capitalized on that, in my opinion. But obviously, the actual government itself, as you know, is more about divisions among Jews and among Arabs. So there was a lot of competition within the joint list when Ram was part of it. And as you know, Bennett and the right wing, these are all calculations that are political in the end. The question is whether they're sustainable. What we know among Palestinian Israelis is that at the same time that they remain completely supportive of Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, they also want to be part of politics in Israel. And after the Gaza war in May, when in fact it came into Israel itself, into cities, joint cities like Akko and Lud, you had a lot of fear about the escalation. And I don't think Palestinian Israelis and polls show that want that escalation. So it's a tension that is ongoing between you want better relations within, you want to participate, but you also want to support the Palestinians. No one knows where the balance will go or how it'll be maintained.
Ksenia, please. Yeah.
Just a small incident that happened when I was campaigning back in 2015, and there was this thing that was called the Zionist Union, long gone for now, the union between Labor and Hatnoa. Since I'm an Arabic speaker, so I was sent also to the Arab sector, to talk to in Baqa al Gharbia and the other places. And I remember that time after time when I came, somebody who arranged this meeting just told me, a small tip. Don't talk to us about Abu Mazen or Ramallah or PA. We know all of this stuff better than you. Tell us how you can make our life here better. How can you fix our roads? How you can build new schools? So it was every single time. I will never forget it. It was quite clear that, the Palestinian issue is always there, just as with the Arabs in the other countries. It's the background, it's the raison d'etre, this is something that exists. But in the meanwhile, we also want to live and enjoy equality in our state.
Ksenia, I wonder, just following up on that, the desire for improved quality of life. One of the things that we have seen this broad coalition government advance is, on the margins, some actually important steps in terms of increased worker permits, building permits for Palestinian construction in Area C, some steps that have been under this kind of view of shrinking the conflict, of it's nothing that reaches the political level, but things that seek to stabilize or improve the situation on the ground. And I wonder, has it had any impact, actually, on the Palestinian scene, or is it viewed as having an impact and having improved quality of life? And, how is that perceived from the Palestinian side?
It's good that these steps are taking place. It's better than that they are taking place rather than not. But at the same time, it feels like we are going in circles. We are repeating on exactly the same things that already happened. Yeah. We already had many Palestinian workers in our towns. Yeah. We already had all of this. There were Paris agreements in 1994 that stipulated, how the economic relations will develop, and we should be already right now in another point of development of this relation. So while it's a small positive step, but it's kind of too little too late. This is my fear, that the steps should be, taken long time ago. During the last 12 years almost, nothing happened. Nothing happened. not even single, I don't know, apartment was approved in Kalkilia area, for example. I know this stuff because, you know, I covered them as a reporter, just the daily reporting. And then, you know, when this sentiment of, so what next? You know, you don't allow us to build, you don't allow us to this, you don't allow us to develop, we cannot build our businesses and this and that. There is the complexity, of course, of the PA and the corruption there. And then you go to the next level, which is another violent outbreak. This is, you know, this is the fear that we are approaching this time. And when you are looking at the profile of the terrorists who are committing these horrific attacks on Israelis, on Jews, all of them, you look at them, they're 1912, 1920, their age, you know? So all of them were born or in the midst of the Second Intifada. They don't know the Second Intifada. But this is kind of new generation that is basically leading us out of complete devastation and the realization that, well, there will be another 5,000 permits for workers. So what, you know? So it barely allows you to make, you know, a living in a situation in which you see no future, you know? There is no political outcome. And if there is no political outcome, then I'm afraid that these little steps of goodwill, you know, this is how they're called, they're just not sufficient. They're not enough.
Did you want to?
Just in agreement, just to say that, look, improving people's lives is good as an end in itself. I mean, you know, how could you argue with that? It's essential, it's needed, it's desperate. But to have the delusion that this is going to transform a political conflict, that is going to stop people from calling for freedom and equality politically, it's just that, it's a delusion.
So I want to end with a final question for each of you, and it's I hope you like this question, which is I want you to plug what you're working on now. What are you focused on right now, or what's upcoming that has really been the focus of your attention that you think those of us, both in this room and watching virtually, should be paying attention to? Maybe I'll start with you, Natan.
Oy vey. Well, I just completed a draft manuscript for a book on an issue no one here cares about, one state, two state, and that kind of things. So, so look forward, please. It'll be excellent for the background of your Zoom. You don't need to read it, but buy it for the background of your Zoom once it comes out. And right now it's called Autopilot. We'll see. I want to also briefly though plug one more point that you made, and that's actually worked partly by IPF. The question of how to leverage the Abraham Accords for things on the Palestinian issue and in large. That's something else that we're looking on also at Brookings. There are so many huge challenges in the Middle East that need an enormous amount of attention, even beyond the political issue, even beyond the Palestinian-Israeli issue. From other conflicts to climate change, which is getting worse and will exacerbate many existing problems for hundreds of millions of people. Okay, we're talking about massive, huge problems. They will also, by the way, project to Europe with refugee flows. So even Europe-focused people will care about it tremendously. We also have opportunities to address some of this. It won't be easy. I think the Abraham Accords, and especially if Saudi Arabia gets involved, are things that can be leveraged for this. I agree very much with the sentiment that was said that, you know, this does not solve the core issue that I care about tremendously too, which is the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And in some ways, it retards our ability to affect it. And so one of the big challenges is exactly how to leverage this. So the work that Sheila and Michael and Evan did and others, I think this is a very important thing for us to do. And it's important for the United States to think about this as, you know, regardless of whether Kushner did it, he did. We need to be able to use what we have, whatever we have, and especially if a moment of change happens. Ksenia mentioned the possibility of generational change in the PA. A lot of things that seem extremely stuck right now, and of course they do, and extremely dire, and they do, could be unlocked if we see different figures. It could get worse for quite a while. I think that's quite possible. But from there, we might also be able to see some kind of potential. And using the Abraham Accords, since they're so popular in Israel, also might give some leverage in the Israeli political system. I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it. I think the fact that there was already this agreement weakens the argument for resolving the Palestinian issue in Israel. For the Palestinian issue, it's a negative at the moment. How do we leverage that? How do we change that? How do we use that when a moment of opportunity comes? And it may come before we think, is a very important thing. And also, I was tasked with giving a bit of optimism for my last answer, so there it is.
Shibley.
Well, right now I'm just the short term. I have a poll in the field just for related to the issues that you asked me about that we should have the end of this week, and I'll probably publish a Brookings piece on the results. It also includes a lot of things on Ukraine to follow up to one.
This is polling the region. Where
No, this is a
Americans-
poll in the U.S. American public opinion, attitudes toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also attitudes toward Ukraine. Those two big issues. We also have questions on race, and we should have the results this week. But on books, I have a forthcoming book with Cornell University Press. It's co-edited book on this issue. It's called The One-State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine? It's mostly political scientists and really looking at it not as a prescriptive enterprise, but as saying what is going on and how do we describe it, analyze it. And we don't have, not everybody is in full agreement in this volume, but it should be forthcoming later this year. I just finished co-authoring another book on American policy toward Israel-Palestine. It's on the Trump administration and the Obama administration policies, analyzing them from the perspective of things that we've been talking about, with a lot of interviews of the principals during those years. And that should also be coming out with Cornell University Press and the USIP Press. And I'm still continuing, this is the 6th year of my work on a long-term project on evangelicals, politics in Israel, another book project that's based on polling, interviews, and historical analysis. So those are the, obviously they're all tied to some of the things that we've talked about, and they're on the way.
Fascinating. Ksenia, what's on your mind?
So I will continue the tradition with the books. And sorry, no surprises.
Got a lot
here.
of reading ahead of us. Yeah.
I was, going to say that I'm going to fly to the, outer space, but no, books. So last year I published, despite the COVID difficulties and all of that, I published my first book, which is in Hebrew, it's called Al Akivim B'Mizrach HaTichon, and the loose translation is On High Heels in the Middle East, as you can see. It's the recollections of reporters' impressions from the Middle East that the Israelis do not know, because they do not have a chance to really know it. It's recollections from refugee camps in Gaza and in the West Bank, but also from Damascus and Cairo and Lebanon and Tripoli and so on, other cities that I visited, conversations with leaders and so on. So now I'm working on the translation of this book to English. Hopefully it will be done soon. And another project, it's also a book, which has to do a lot with what you, Shibley, mentioned, this unholy alignment with illiberal forces specifically, I'm examining in this book project relations between Russia and Israel during the 2 decades of Putin's rule. Yes, so how... Yeah, I want to read it myself already. But it's still plenty of work. But in this book, I'm trying to analyze how indeed Russia became such an influential power in Israel during Vladimir Putin, how it changed Israel, and what happened, in the course of this soft intervention, I would say, yes, of oligarchs, money, people, culture, that just happened in our country during the last 2 decades.
Well, I just want to thank you all and welcome you back when you have all of these books published to speak with Israel Policy Forum
Book
about
fair the next time.
Yeah. I'll turn it over to Alan. Thank you.
I too want to thank the panelists for a really excellent discussion. I would just say that, based on what we've been able to listen to last night and this morning, this is why we have a Washington Policy Conference. This is why people should be interested in Israel Policy Forum, because there aren't other places where you get a discussion of this depth and sophistication and variety. And we have our leadership to thank for it, and we have our panelists to thank for it. So we really appreciate your being with us today. We still have a full day ahead of us. Don't go anywhere. And to lay the groundwork and the foundation for the day ahead, David is going to describe for you where we go from here.
Hello. Okay. So from here, on the back of your name tags, you will see which sessions you've signed up for as we head into our breakouts. We'll have the first set of breakouts examining in depth the Palestinian scene, with one of the breakouts, as you all know, looking at the investment in Palestinian people, the civil and economic situation amongst the Palestinians. The second session dealing more with the security dynamics impacting the Israeli-Palestinian arena. The information of where those sessions are located is directly behind your name tag. It is also on the program that is inside your materials, as I cannot recall off the top of my head which room's which. After that breakout, there will be lunch provided in this main hallway, which you can grab lunch to head into the second session of breakouts, examining more in-depth the regional dynamics, both in terms of the normalization and where that's headed in an in-depth way, and specifically looking at the roles of Egypt and Jordan. We have a terrific panelists to join us throughout the day. And towards the end of the day, we'll have a break. We'll invite everyone back here for our Capitol Hill training sessions to examine how we will go about our meetings with members of Congress later this week. And then we'll conclude with conversations, a closing plenary this afternoon, speaking with both Martin Indyk, former ambassadors Martin Indyk and Dan Shapiro, and ending today with a conversation with Hadi Amr, the Biden administration's point person on the Israeli-Palestinian arena. I look forward to what will be a fascinating day ahead, and I feel like we've now gone from scratching the surface to a little bit deeper. And we're about to really dive in a deep, deep way. And so I thank you all for the conversations to come, and I look forward to it all. So thank you again, and thank you to the panelists.